This round, designed to pierce steel, would aid law enforcement through one of the United States' worst crime waves. And with its creation, the Pandora's box of Magnum handgun cartridges was opened. This would set a new standard for what a man-stopping handgun round could be. This is the story of the .357 Magnum. In order to understand the roots of the .357 Magnum, we have to look at the old cowboy round that came before it. Released in 1898, the .38 Special is a black powder round, which was designed to have improved penetration compared to that of the older .38 Long Colt round. As the limiting factor in regards to power for many old black powder rounds was the round's length or powder capacity. When a round's casing or brass is extended, it increases the volume of black powder a round could store. And using this principle, the .38 Special's extra case space allowed for a large load of gunpowder, which in turn made the round much more powerful than the smaller .38 Long Colt. The increase in power with the .38 Special was well received by the public and those who carried handguns. So well received, even the United States military and many law enforcement agencies across the country would come to adopt the .38 Special. But before we get into that, we need to look at how the .38 Special has changed and evolved over the years. As time progressed, the use of black powder would fall out of fashion, as the new higher pressure, smokeless gunpowder gained prominence in the firearms industry. The .38 Special switched from its original black powder loadings to use a much more powerful smokeless gunpowder. The use of this smokeless gunpowder, paired with the vast quantity of .38 Special bullet designs, provided those who carried the .38 Special a vast variety of different loadings of the round, which could tackle almost any task you could ask a revolver for the time. The beauty of the .38 Special was its simplicity. It used a 1.155 rimmed brass casing, which was loaded with a .357 caliber bullet, which meant the width of the bullet was 0.357 of an inch wide. But aside from following these basic parameters, handloaders could adjust the .38 Special round in almost any way that could suit their needs. The loader did not have to worry if the round was precisely loaded to feed and cycle in a semi-automatic handgun, as the .38 Special was a round designed to be mainly used in revolvers. Compared to other handgun rounds, the long .38 Special cartridge was seen as the optimal blank canvas for ammo manufacturers and reloaders. The power and the recoil of the round can be easily tweaked by adding or reducing gunpowder, with the more powerful loadings being limited by the strength of the revolvers which fired the round. Aside from the powder loading, the long case length also left plenty of room for manufacturers to load a wide variety of different bolt designs. These bolt designs would vary drastically in both weight and shape, with most .38 Special bullet weights ranging between 110 to 200 grains. One of the most common .38 Special rounds one would find used the classic 158 grain bullet, but much heavier bolt designs would become more popular as the round was adopted by police departments across the United States, with the most infamous law enforcement-oriented .38 Special loading being dubbed the .38 Super Police. The .38 Super Police used a long and heavy 200 grain blunt round-nosed bullet, which at the time was thought to cause significant wound cavities, as the long heavy bullet was known to tumble upon hitting the target. As America entered the 1920s, the .38 Special's use as a law enforcement round would be put to the test, as on January 17, 1920, the United States government and its officials began the enforcement of the National Alcohol Prohibition Act, starting what is known today as the Prohibition era. This legislation widely banned the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages across the United States, in turn labeling many former law-abiding Americans who chose to continue to drink as criminals. As you can imagine, the underground black market for liquor surged in prominence due to the prohibition legislation, and with it, violent crime and homicide rates also rose across the nation. Many police departments found themselves stretched thin in both manpower and resources as crime increased, in addition to having to enforce the new Prohibition laws. But things were about to get a whole lot worse in years to come, as in 1929 the stock market would crash and the Great Depression would begin. Fighting gangs and moonshiners was already difficult enough for law enforcement, but the rise of a new type of dangerous criminal would challenge the limited capabilities and arsenals of law enforcement. Throughout the end of the 1920s, going into the 1930s, more Americans than ever have gained access to automobiles across the United States. And this, understandably, increased the frequency in which automobiles were being used in crimes, with some criminals using automobiles in often violent robbing sprees. These criminals would become known as auto bandits, and they used the extreme mobility provided by their vehicles to commit chains of often violent armed bank robberies across vast rural areas of the country, with the goal of fleeing the crime scene long before law enforcement could arrive. But this was not always the case. The shootouts which occurred between law enforcement and the auto bandits revealed the inadequacy of many police departments' arsenals at the time, as their normal, everyday duty weapons were not designed with automobiles in mind. The .38 Special, when used on soft, fleshy targets, would perform adequately, but the round had issues with hard barrier penetration, and these issues would become very much a problem, as law enforcement noticed their .38 Special revolvers failed to penetrate the steel bodies of these automobiles. Thus, there was a demand for a new round, a round which was powerful enough to penetrate the steel bodies of automobiles and any body armor criminals could get their hands on. But this round still needed to be small enough to fit in everyday duty weapons that officers carried. This round would be developed by the firearms manufacturer Smith & Wesson and designed by Phil Sharp, Douglas Wesson, and my personal favorite of the three, Elmer Keith. And Elmer Keith deserves a video all of his own, and I'll likely make one in the future, but for today, I'm going to focus on just his contributions to the .357 Magnum. Elmer Keith was the man who would later become known as the father of big bore handgunning. But before this, in the 1920s and 30s, Elmer Keith was a firearms writer, a rancher, a big game hunting guide, and a reloader who was obsessed with pushing the revolver to its absolute limits. Keith would take common revolver cartridges and load them to fire at much higher pressures. In the process, Keith would destroy many revolvers which he owned, as he exceeded the limits of what the revolvers could handle. In his testing, Keith would come to favor a rather robust revolver designed by Smith & Wesson. This revolver was called the Smith & Wesson 3844. The Smith & Wesson 3844 was released in 1930 and was essentially the first baby steps for what would become the .357 Magnum revolver. The 3844 was chambered for the common .38 Special round, but instead of using the regular .38 Special sized frame, the revolver used a larger and much more robust .44 Special revolver frame and cylinder. This thicker cylinder and frame allowed the .3844 to withstand much higher pressured loadings. Loadings like those made by people such as Elmer Keith. These specialty high-pressure .38 Special rounds fired projectiles at much higher velocities than the standard .38 Special loadings. This improved the .38 Special's ability to penetrate hard barriers and create soft tissue damage. The .3844 revolver offered an increase in power, which was well received by police officers and reloaders, but a potential issue emerged. There was always the potential risk of an overpressured .38 Special round intended for use only in the .3844 revolver becoming mixed up with normal everyday .38 Special ammunition. If an overpressured .38 Special round were to find its way into a normal .38 Special revolver, the outcome could be catastrophic, as the cylinder of the standard .38 Special revolver would fail under the additional pressure, essentially turning the cylinder into a small pipe bomb. The concept of an overpressured .38 Special had real-world potential, but needed refinement. A new revolver was needed. A revolver which still used the widely available .38 Special ammunition, but could also fire a new, much more powerful round. A round which could provide the power necessary to pierce steel automobiles, but would also be unable to be chambered in a .38 Special revolver for safety reasons. The solution for this dilemma was to keep the same exact casing and bullet width as the .38 Special, but to extend the overall length of the casing in order to make the new cartridge too long to fit properly in a .38 Special revolver cylinder. This new round, released in 1935, was designated as the .357 Magnum. The original .357 Magnum loading was an absolute powerhouse, launching a 158 grain bullet at 1,525 feet per second out of an 8 3/4 inch long barrel. This loading not only far surpassed the .38 Special, but surpassed every handgun round at the time, as the .357 Magnum held the title of the most powerful handgun in the world from 1935 up until 1955, when Elmer Keith would outdo himself once again and release his next Magnum handgun cartridge, the .44 Magnum. But that video is for another day, as this video is for the .357 Magnum. The original .357 Magnum revolvers were released in 1935 and were known as the registered Magnums. This was because every revolver came with its own unique registration number in order to prove the revolver's authenticity. The registered Magnums were initially planned to be more boutique, custom-ordered firearms, which were to be made in small quantities as they cost a whopping $60 in 1935, which was during the Great Depression. $60 at that time roughly equates to $1,367 in 2024. And again, this was during the Great Depression when no one had any extra money for spending. This further emphasizes the immense cost of this firearm. The first registered Magnum would be given to FBI Director at the time, John Edgar Hoover, with the rest of the registered Magnums being custom-ordered firearms. These revolvers were quite large by today's standard for a 6-shot .357 Magnum revolver. The revolvers sported a large frame, which would later become known by Smith & Wesson as their in-frame design. The registered Magnum's sheer size and power commanded authority, and its refined features and craftsmanship also appealed to firearms connoisseurs. The revolver could be custom ordered with a large variety of finishes, sights, triggers, hammers, and barrel lengths, which usually range between 3.5 to 8 3/4 inches. The revolvers were customizable to the extent that customers could even request a specified zero distance for their sights, which meant Smith & Wesson employees would precisely zero the revolver's sights at the factory, so whenever the revolver was delivered to your door, it would be ready to shoot and sight in. Regardless of the high cost, and Smith & Wesson's respectable production of 120 registered Magnums a month, the company became backlogged with orders for the registered Magnum, as there was a great demand for the most powerful handgun in the world, with the Kansas City Police Department even going as far as being the first police department to issue the wildly expensive handgun to its officers. The registered Magnum was an immense success, with the concept of the most powerful handgun in the world selling itself to law enforcement and civilians who wanted to possess such a powerful handheld weapon. Nevertheless, Smith & Wesson would begin to generate publicity on the potency of the .357 Magnum round in order to further its sales. Articles and pictures would emerge of the .357 Magnum taking all kinds of large game, to include moose, grizzly bears, big cats, elk, antelope, tapirs, and even a walrus. With this great publicity and high demand, Smith & Wesson would end the production of the custom-tailored registered Magnums, and in 1939 begin the production of the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, which essentially was the same gun as the registered Magnum, but it did not come with a special registry number. The production of the .357 Magnum revolver would also be simplified compared to that of the older registered Magnum. as it was released with different pre-configured features and barrel lengths which allowed easier mass production. This was done in order to better meet the high demand for these Magnum firearms. The new mass-produced, non-registered .357 Magnum revolver continued to sell well, but the production of the new .357 Magnum revolver would cease in 1941 as the United States entered World War II and Smith & Wesson shifted its production towards the war effort. Around 5,500 registered Magnums and 1,400 non-registered .357 Magnums were produced before the war, and some of these revolvers would be purchased and even used as personal weapons in World War II, with the most famous example being General George Patton's ivory-gripped registered Magnum, which he referred to as, and I quote, his killing gun, unquote. After the war, in 1946, the production of the .357 Magnum revolver would continue, and wartime President Harry S. Truman would even be gifted one of the new post-war produced .357 Magnums. Jumping ahead to 1954, Smith & Wesson would release the Highway Patrolman revolver, which was mechanically an identical revolver to the previous .357 Magnum revolver, except this one had a cheaper finish. This cheaper finish allowed the revolver to be more affordable for both law enforcement and the public. The Highway Patrolman sold well and would be adopted by many state police departments and highway patrol organizations. In 1955, Smith & Wesson would ditch the large and heavy in-frame design and produce a small-framed, lighter .357 Magnum revolver. And this revolver would arguably become Smith & Wesson's second most iconic revolver in cinema. This revolver would be released as the Combat Magnum, but would later better be known for its future designation as the Model 19. Upon its release, the Model 19 was well received. Law enforcement officers and hunters enjoyed having the same firepower as the larger Highway Patrolman revolver, but in a smaller, lighter package. A smaller, lighter firearm with the same capacity and firepower may not sound like a huge upgrade from the previous model, but for those who carried the revolver daily, the improved comfort which came from carrying a lighter firearm on their hip was well worth the upgrade. Before I continue with more .357 Magnum revolver designs, it's important I address how Smith & Wesson categorizes its revolvers by their frame size. Smith & Wesson revolver frame sizes are given a corresponding letter of the alphabet based on the size of the revolver's frame, with the general rule being that a revolver classified with letters which are towards the end of the alphabet being the larger framed revolvers, and frames classified with letters towards the beginning of the alphabet are usually going to be your smaller framed revolvers. The first of the smaller framed revolvers we will cover are the J-frames. Being some of the smallest revolvers offered by Smith & Wesson, J-frames were limited by their smaller size, usually leaving them with a capacity of 5 or 6 rounds of .38 Special, or 5 rounds of .357 Magnum. The next size up from the J-frames are the K-frames, which commonly held 6 rounds of .38 Special or .357 Magnum, and possess the full capacity of a fighting revolver in a small, light package. The previously mentioned Smith & Wesson Model 19 falls into this category as a K-frame. Growing even larger, the next frame size up is the L-frame. The L-frame came out in the 1980s with the Smith & Wesson models 586 and 686. The larger size of the L-frame increased the durability of the revolver, while also providing additional room for a larger cylinder, which, upon its release, held 6 rounds of .357 Magnum. But later iterations of the 686 could be found with an impressive 7-round cylinder that holds .357 Magnum. Growing even larger, we return to the original .357 Magnum frame size, which was denoted as the N-frame. In contrast to the original 6-shot .357 Magnum in-frame design, modern in-frame revolvers can easily hold up to 8 rounds of .357 Magnum, and it also happens to be the standard frame size of most .44 Magnums. Now that we have covered the history and the basics of the .357 Magnum, I'd like to take a look at the iconic and unique .357 Magnums you may have seen in different forms of media. We will start with Colt's most iconic snake gun, the Colt Python. Since its introduction all the way back in 1955, the Python has been praised for its amazing double-action trigger and lockup, gathering a wide cult following over the years, as it serves as the most iconic example of a .357 Magnum in TV and in cinema. The appearance of the Python sports a ribbed top strap and a full underlug, all along Colt's large I-frame design. This robust design gave the Python strength to handle the hottest loads the .357 Magnum could offer with complete ease, in addition to giving the revolver its own unique profile. This revolver has been seen in countless works of cinema, to include Scarface, Magnum Force, The Other Guys, and many other works, with likely the most iconic use of the Python being the hit 2010 TV series, The Walking Dead. In The Walking Dead, the Colt Python is wielded by former sheriff and main protagonist Rick Grimes. The Walking Dead is an excellent example of media, which showcases the Python's charisma and authority in much of its key scenes and advertising, with another great example being the Call of Duty Black Ops video game series, where the Python can also be found in all of its glory. Up until this point, we have only covered conventional revolvers which fire rounds from the top of their cylinders. But there are revolvers with the opposite design in mind, the two most famous examples consisting of the Italian-made Mateba and Rhino revolvers. Both the Mateba and the Rhino would break the trend of most revolvers which came before, and fire at the bottom of their cylinders. This strange design choice was made in an effort to lower the weapon's bore axis, which in turn reduced the weapon's muzzle flip under the heavy recoil of the .357 Magnum cartridge. I apologize because I'm probably going to pronounce this revolver in 3 different ways and all of them are probably going to be wrong, but I'm going to try. The Mateba Model 6 Unica was created by Italian gun designer Emilio Giussani and went into production in 1997 as one of the few semi-automatic revolvers ever made. And that's correct, this revolver is semi-automatic. The Mateba's upper assembly, consisting of the barrel, cylinder, and upper frame, was designed to slide rearward on the lower assembly under the heavy recoil of the .357 Magnum, in the process rotating the weapon's cylinder and cocking its hammer. In this state, the Mateba was already pre-cocked and ready to be fired with a crisp single-action trigger pull. Thus, the Mateba uniquely was a revolver which could reliably fire all 6 of its rounds with a single-action trigger pull. A very cool and unique concept, but unfortunately, the production of Mateba revolvers would cease in 2005. Its legacy would live on though through various works of media, such as the 2014 movie The Maze Runner, and in the 1995 animated movie Ghost in the Shell. In the realm of video games, the Mateba can be found in the 2013 release of Watch Dogs, and in my personal favorite use of the Mateba, in the also 2013 release of Battlefield 4. The Kappa Rhino was another great revolver designed by Emilio Giussani, and was the last firearm he designed before his death in 2008. 2 years after his passing in 2010, Giussani's design would go into production, providing the world with yet another odd-looking revolver which fired from the bottom of its cylinder. The Rhino, yet still internally complex for a revolver, greatly simplified the concept presented with the Mateba, and it did entirely away with the whole concept of a semi-automatic revolver. Instead, the Rhino would revert back to functioning like a traditional double-action revolver, where the cylinder and the hammer were operated solely by the force of the finger pulling the trigger, with the slight caveat of the Rhino using an internal hammer. The external piece, which appears to be a hammer, was actually just a lever attached to some linkage. This external lever was used to cock the internal hammer in order to let the user fire the Rhino with a crisp single-action trigger pull. Externally, the Rhino may appear bulky and unwieldy, but the revolver is actually quite light. as its receiver was made from a single block of strong yet light CNC'd aluminum alloy. The Rhino's sci-fi-esque appeal does not end with its space-age materials, as the combination of its ribbed top strap and unique grip angle provide the Rhino with a one-of-a-kind silhouette. This unique-looking revolver can be found in video games such as The Division, Battlefield 4, and Escape from Tarkov. But the most famous example of this revolver in popular media is its use in the 2016 movie The Suicide Squad, where Harley Quinn can be seen in multiple scenes sporting the 6-inch barreled variant of the iconic firearm. If you are looking for a revolver with some space cowboy charisma to it, this may be it, as it can also be seen in the sci-fi 2017 live adaptation of the Ghost in the Shell movie. Since the conception of the .357 Magnum revolver, the standard capacity has always been expected to be around 6 rounds, but things could always be better. A 7-shot variant of the Smith & Wesson 686 would be released in 1996, renamed as the 686 Plus, keeping the same L-size frame as the original 686, but adding an additional chamber to its large cylinder, resulting in a 7-shot revolver which weighed slightly less than the original 6-shot model. This concept of increasing the capacity of a revolver would also be implemented by Ruger Firearms, with their release of a 7-shot variant of their classic GP100 revolver. But why stop at 7 when things could be even better? A line of 8-round .357 Magnum revolvers would later be released by Smith & Wesson, with its variants being built off the original .357 Magnum's large in-frame design. Smith & Wesson's 8-shot models include the 627, the 327, and my personal favorite, the R8/TRR8 models, with the main difference between the two models being very minor, with each model using slightly different front sights and barrel shrouds. The Smith & Wesson R8 was a large but lightweight 8-shot revolver, which is constructed of a lightweight scandium alloy frame rather than the usual heavy steel frames you find in revolvers. The R8 uniquely has both a top rail and a bottom rail. This allows the user to attach accessories not commonly found in revolvers, such as weapon lights, optics, and any other attachment someone would put on a revolver. The combination of all these features leaves the R8 as an excellent lightweight high-capacity Magnum, which can easily be outfitted for both hunting or personal defense. Another great high-capacity revolver is the 8-shot variant of the ruggedly constructed Ruger Red Hawk. Built off Ruger's heavy cast steel .44 Magnum frame, the .357 Magnum 8-shot variant is both incredibly heavy and incredibly durable. This increased heft allows the revolver to have little to no felt recoil when firing the most stout .357 Magnum loads. It incorporates a style completely contradictory to that of the R8. Instead of trying to appear sleek and tactical like the R8, the Red Hawk would appeal to a more old-fashioned cowboy nostalgia, looking more like a beefed-up single-action revolver rather than a weapon of the future. The .357 Magnum would also find itself used amongst a wide variety of different lever-action rifles, as the .357 Magnum round was found to benefit greatly from the additional barrel length of a rifle. A .357 Magnum bullet fired from a 16-inch rifle barrel gains a significant amount of velocity over that of a round fired from a 4-inch revolver barrel, resulting in a round which hits much harder downrange. For example, a round fired from a 16-inch rifle barrel possesses almost double the energy of a round fired from a 4-inch revolver barrel. The additional weight of the rifle platform also greatly reduces the felt recoil of the .357 Magnum, leaving the user with a light and handy rifle with almost no felt recoil, and this rifle conveniently uses the same ammunition as your handgun. This about does it for my .357 Magnum rant. If you're interested in lever-action rifles and their development, I will hopefully have a whole video on the topic by the time you see this video right here. Thank you for watching my video on the 357 Magnum. If you liked the video, feel free to subscribe in order to see future content. Thank you, and have a good day.